So over the last several years, I think that I have more or less either been on or moderated some version of this panel at least twice a year. And so the great thing about that is that I know our panelists very well, and I know many of you do too. But we really have kind of the range of people on this panel. You know, Sara has a background that rivals all of us with respect to kind of her knowledge of the way the SEC works and her experience here in D.C. Mark works for a firm that has kind of a broad business background, but kind of the mid-market companies. And Brian works with a number of the much larger, you know, at a big firm. He works with a lot larger companies and really gets to be a subject matter expert because of the types of clients that he has. And so we have this range, and you've heard so far from Brian and Mark, so I'm going to let Sara kind of start off the festivities. And what I really want you to, I guess, focus on is maybe 5 years ago or whatever we started having this panel. There was a lot of worry about kind of fraud and these other things that I guess were more traditional kind of worries about what happens in marketplaces. But now we're kind of 5 years into it, and we have more or less, I guess, the groundwork for what we're going to be dealing with for the next several years. And so your reactions over the last year or so, what you're seeing in the market, and some stories, I guess, would be great about some of the things that you've seen that that would maybe be great anecdotes for everybody to hear.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if they're really great anecdotes, but...
or sad anecdotes.
Yeah, they're kind of scary in times. I mean, we've now had nearly a year of Reg CF operating. And I've got two major observations, and one is compliance with Regulation CF, absolutely abysmal. It is pathetic, it is useless. I really think everybody needs to push companies to comply better. On Monday, the annual report filing date was due. It was the date in which anybody who had raised funds under Regulation A, Regulation CF, and also it was Reg A filing date too, but everybody was supposed to have filed their annual report by Monday. By my calculations, and these are very approximate because I'm taking two sources. One is the guys who filed Form CU to say we finished our filing, we finished our offering, and the other is anyone who has done a partial offering under the SEC's permission to have rolling closes, which is a sort of more amorphous thing because it's not an actual filing. As I calculate it, over 100 companies should have filed a CAR, and less than 40 did. That's not a really good rate. And the problem with this, and the fact that compliance with the disclosure requirements in general has not been particularly good, is it's very hard to go to the regulators and say, you have to be more flexible because we're not managing to comply with anything. Going to a regulator and say, make the rules easier because we're really, really bad at complying with them is not something that really flies in DC. So compliance in general needs to be brought up. So that's the compliance with Reg CF bucket. The other thing that I've seen over the course of the year is it's really not even complying with the securities laws that's the problem here. It's complying with the corporate laws. So we have had companies that do not exist issuing shares. In order to continue to exist as a company, you have to keep paying your franchise taxes to Delaware. If you do not pay your franchise taxes to Delaware for 3 years in a row, they declare you to be void as a company. If you are void as a company, you cannot issue company shares. It's a really basic thing. So that was one. Another one is even if you are an existing company, if you sell shares, they should really exist before you sell them. Seen that one happen. Another one is the one that Joan mentioned. If your bylaws say securities must be represented by physical shares, they have to be represented by physical shares, and you have to go and change your bylaws in order for that to be a valid issuance. And I could go on. A lot of these come from the fact that we're dealing with small companies. Usually it's not venal, it's not intentional, but we see this problem again and again and again. So I'm sorry to be a downer. I still believe in this. I'm going to make it work. I'm going to drag people screaming and kicking into compliance if I can. But it's a challenge that I think as an industry we really have to pay attention to. Compliance with the securities laws, compliance with the corporate laws. I don't care that the laws are stupid. We get this a lot. Well, why do I have to do that? That's stupid. Yeah, I know Silicon Valley, it's stupid, but you still got to do it, because otherwise, the problem is, and here is the enforcement thing that could be happening. I don't know if people noticed, last night, the SEC sent out letters to companies who should have filed a 1K by Monday and didn't. If you are still raising funds under Regulation A or Regulation CF, and you are not up to date with your ongoing reporting requirements, filing a Form 1K or filing a Form CAR, you are violating Section 5 of the Securities Act. Violating Section 5 of the Securities Act means that the investors can put the securities back to you, rescission, like take them back. So that's like having a permanent put hanging over your head. It also means that the SEC could, and has in the past, issue a cease and desist order that says you've been selling securities when you didn't have an exemption for doing it. We're filing a cease and desist order. If the cease and desist order is upheld by the administrative law judges, that becomes a bad act, which means you can't ever use Reg CF again, or Reg D, or Reg A for 10 years. So really, there's a huge incentive to get it right. But like I say, we are going to make this work, but we really have got to focus on compliance, because it's very difficult for us to argue that we need flexibility, that we need concessions when we're doing such a bad job in complying with the rules as they are. Sorry.
So no. So I do need to clarify for people who are a little bit newer. You've always been a downer, but the best. But the best. I mean, maybe it's the fact that you actually know what compliance is, but it could be the accent or that you're just great. But Mark, you have like some insight into this, obviously, because you and I see a lot of people who I would just say are in the mid-market, and we're seeing this kind of, well, I would say like a lack of interest in Reg CF. Would you agree with that? From maybe interest, but once kind of it's explained to them a lack of actual interest, and seeing a lot more companies who are more interested, and maybe it's our persuasion in Reg A. Has that been your experience as well?
Well, yes, and I do personally want to thank Sara. I was in a really good mood this morning, which is not good for an attorney. And I want to thank Sara for bringing me back to earth. But I will say, one, I sort of see the glass half full. These are growing pains of a young industry. And thank goodness there are people like Sara and CrowdCheck out there, to help companies comply. So that's a unrequested,
Even
plug.
when they don't want to.
Even when they don't want to. But, and I will also say that, so this is kind of a built-in issue with Regulation CF in particular. It's this brand new animal, untested, untried. It's for little companies, for the most part. Little, unsophisticated companies with, yes, unsophisticated lawyers. And the missing piece, as we all know, is compliance costs money. And these companies, when they're listing on a crowdfunding portal, the reason that the disclosures are so poor, as a general matter, is they don't have the money to pay for good disclosures. And nobody has yet figured out how to make it affordable for these companies to
500 bucks. Sorry.
Well, not for 500. Well, okay, but I will just say it is not. There's no really perfect solution for small companies to make the disclosures, all of the disclosures that they are required to make for a securities offering under Regulation CF. So it's a built-in issue that no one has solved yet. I don't know how it's going to be solved, but I certainly do agree that going back to Congress and saying, well, increase the limits, give us more scope to not comply is probably not an issue.
Do so well, yeah.
And since I have the opportunity, I will say that in the Regulation A space, what I see is a thundercloud looming on the horizon. If we're gonna be downers here, is that paradoxically, as Regulation A has become better known, and as more dollars begin to slosh through the pipes, unsavory kinds of folks, are beginning to take interest. And again, I get calls from people, all kinds of people every day, and I'm beginning, and have been for the last, say, 6 months, to see a lot of interest from folks that we really would prefer not be involved in the Regulation A industry. People who have told me they plan to sell these shares through boiler rooms, for example. So this is another challenge. I think it's a greater challenge than noncompliance, because if those folks get their fingers into this industry, and I don't know how we're going to keep that from happening, that would really cast a permanent pall, I think, over all of the good that you and everyone else are trying to do.
I think is kind of a comment, which then I'll throw it to Brian. One of the kind of old images that we have of the way penny stocks worked were boiler rooms. People would be just calling and pumping stock in a way to create volume, which would push up share prices, at least temporarily allow insiders to sell. And we dealt with that in kind of the beginnings of the internet. And now what we're seeing is, in this world of general solicitation, right, what we're seeing basically the same thing, with the caveat that, of course, we are supposed to have verification of the accredited investor status of the individuals. There is an effort which I think will be successful either through congressional action or at the SEC, especially now that we have 3 commissioners, and I believe that Commissioner Stein rotates out June 5th, right? It's this year or next year?
Not sure.
I think she rotates out this year. So we're going to have a different SEC. So I think we're going to see a change in what accredited investor is. So let's throw that to you, Brian. So what is the world going to look like, especially in the world of general solicitation, in your view, over the next couple years? And do we see a world that Mark fears, or do we just see like a heck of a lot more people using what is now 506C, the ability to go out and market?
Yeah, no, I think obviously fraud predated the internet, and is not a new concept. And back in the advertising days and of newspaper ads to telephone boiler rooms to now where you have online fraud, none of that is new. There will always be people who need to be policed. There will always be bad actors who are looking to profit off of unsuspecting victims, and it is a criminal act, and I think you have to distinguish that from the vast majority of companies that are out there legitimately trying to raise capital. When a company fails, it doesn't mean that there was fraud involved, and I think a lot of people think that, especially when you have an online investment with the Invest Now button, that is this company real? Does it really exist? Is this whole thing just a complete sham? And am I investing in something that actually exists? And it's a little bit more difficult in certain industries like real estate. You can drive by a property, you can verify through third-party records that you're actually investing in something that is a real transaction. But general solicitation has really, I think, transformed how people operate, especially in the online crowd finance world. There are a lot of companies that have tried general solicitation and decided to back away from it, though. And part of the reason is that in the old days of private placements and public offerings, generally anything you did that was blasted out to the outside world was considered an offer. And so people were very concerned that if you had a website or you had a portal or some other mechanism for reaching a group of people who you didn't previously know, that you had somehow engaged in solicitation. The SEC in the 2013 adopting release to Title II actually did the world a favor by refining what solicitation really means to them in the modern era. And it is not just having a website or having an online portal, but actually engaging in the solicitation of a securities offering. If you have an online business that allows investments online, you can go out and promote the business without being deemed to be soliciting under 506. The three real indicia of solicitation are that you have a website which has no password sign-in and you can see live transactions right on the homepage. You use social media to broadcast live transactions, not just the existence of your company. And third, that you send out blast email messages to people who haven't signed up for them that are informing them that there's live deals going on. And this is, so if you're thinking about the real estate context, if I promote the company and say, we're ground floor, we're share estates, come make X returns on our site, that is actually not soliciting under the SEC's definition. But if you say, come look at our latest loan or our latest investment at 123 Main Street, it's an offer that can be accepted, then that's something where they consider solicitation. And that's the dividing line between when you have to verify someone's accredited and when you don't. And what many have realized is that we really don't need to do the deal solicitation. All we want to do is have a website and market the website, and we're fine with the password-protected portal. And what that does is it saves you from the verification step. So surprising to people at the SEC that I've spoken to is there's actually been a backtrack by some who have chosen to solicit and now have refiling Form Ds to tick the box, the 506B box, the non-solicited box, because they don't need that extra element. And the problem with verification is that if you rely on a third-party vendor to verify, then their data cannot be more than 3 months old. And so what happens is a lot of the vendors, and I'm sure some are in this room, will say, okay, we verified this investor in February, it's now May, we need to re-verify that they're accredited. And if your method of verification is your income over the past 2 years, that is a static number. And so if somebody asked me in February what I made in 2015, it's not going to change 3 months later. And so it becomes a nuisance, and that nuisance factor builds to a point where compared to other competitive websites, you're asking for more information, you're asking for me to send in more data that I don't have at my fingertips, like my 1040 or pay stub, and many people are opting towards the non-solicited model. But again, fraud will always be there, and part of the problem with the Reg CF compliance is that the deals are not large enough to attract quality counsel, and the participants in that market are doing a lot of things on a self-service basis. And they're Googling how to do things. They'll get qualified with the SEC and assume that it's a set it and forget it program, that they don't have to do any updating at all. And I think there's just a lot of uneducated folks out there who don't really understand what the burdens are of being a Reg CF company or even a Reg A company after you go through the process. It's not a one-time shot and then you're done.
So, because for a variety of reasons, we have this kind of old rule where companies can go out and raise money and kind of rely on the investor to promise, wink, wink, they're accredited, and the new rule where we have to prove that. What do you see, Sara, as kind of the realistic transformation of what an accredited investor is? Are we going to change the amount of money that we're talking about? Do you believe that we're going to have, as a lot of people have suggested, that, hey, if you have certain experience or a job or an education in a certain field, you can invest in a certain field? Like, how do you see that changing? And then do you think that increases compliance because we have less people who are basically lying or winking because we've changed it, or do we just have a bunch of people that claim that they have education they don't have?
It's one of the interesting things about the accredited market is when you push at the people who say, well, there's loads of fraud in the private market. The fraud is not from whether somebody's accredited or not. I mean, if you're stealing money from grandma, you're stealing money from grandma, whether or not she checks the box that she's got $1 million. And we've never been able to establish the link between where the accredited level is set and the amount of fraud in the market. And I think they're two completely different things. So I do think that there is the possibility that the SEC, as opposed to Congress, I think Dina's right, there's going to be a lot more action on the regulatory side. I would not be at all surprised if we saw the SEC rebalancing the accredited investor standards so that on a going forward basis, they'd up the dollar amounts, but possibly not do it initially, and then add to the accredited community people who have appropriate skills. And I think that the evidence for taking that regulatory action is eminently there. I mean, it's a justifiable thing to do. Mm-hmm. So really hoping that might happen, and it could happen fairly fast.
Yeah, I think that's probably likely. Mark, in your kind of world, is the drive... so securities lawyers have this joke that there's only three types of issues, right? There's registered or qualified issues, there's exempt issues, and there's illegal issues, right? There's only really three. And do you think that this drive that we're seeing in Reg A is kind of a reaction to the idea that you get, I don't know, some sort of like compliance cover because you've gone through this process, and now you just go out to the general public and it's been at least reviewed by a regulator? Or do you think that there's something else that's happening, like in the market and the people that you're talking to?
In my own experience, because I do come from the more from the private placement world than from the IPO world, in my experience, the enthusiasm for Regulation A is that you can raise a lot of money relative, it's that you can raise money from non-accredited investors. That's what it's all about. I was about to say because you can raise a lot more money, but that's not really true, because using either old or new Rule 506, of course, you can raise an unlimited amount of money from what are, in effect, an unlimited number of accredited investors. Yes, the limit is really 2,000, but I've never seen a private placement with close to 2,000 investors. So the world of Regulation A, the enthusiasm from the folks who call me is that, wow, I can raise money from non-accredited investors. That's what it's all about. I've never been able to do that before, and I can raise up to $50 million. And including from some of the people in this room, and I don't have to deal with the frickin' private equity guys anymore. right? I can bypass Wall Street and I can go directly to the investing public. So in my experience, that's where the enthusiasm from the issuer side for Regulation A comes from.
So the friggin' Wall Street kind of segues me to what I wanted to ask Brian. You know, I get a little bit of it, but I bet you get a lot of it. Like, a lot of your day is big financial institutions who just want to know what's going on. They're just like, hey, you know, I know you guys have a guy over there, and so they call you in. So what are the big financial players? What questions are they asking? And what do you think that their kind of appetite is to look in? You know, there was a lot of fear, obviously, at the beginning. Hey, if you guys do a CF, if you do a Reg A, whatever you guys do, you are forever banned from the world of real equity and real markets. What are you kind of sensing now?
Yeah, so the early days was a little bit of, okay, you've done a Reg CF or you've done a Title III crowdfunded transaction. There's an ego issue in that you have this democratization of capital raising, and if you are able to get in at a better valuation than I am as a professional investor, I certainly don't want to go to my investment committee and report that they raised money through a crowdfunded offering, and had we just hit the website 3 weeks ago, we would have bought it at a much better price. I think that has largely subsided. I also think that the fear that you won't be attractive to VC firms if you're doing a Reg A transaction or you're doing a Reg CF deal, I think that has largely subsided. I think that, you know, different investors have different entry points, and most of the companies that are doing these raises are at the very early stages where you wouldn't see much private equity or VC traffic anyway. Every company that comes up to the VC PE bar has some form of angel funding or friends and family or Series A type or seed round funding before they can get, you know, with certain exceptions, of course, if you coming out of something where you have a long track record. And so it is expected that you will have built yourself to some form of scale before you're able to get that type of investment. So I don't think that there's the stigma that people have feared that that you're somehow tainting yourself by having a balance sheet or a shareholder table with crowd investors. A lot of that's been mitigated also because a lot of these sites like AngelList have a single shareholder mechanic. So you would only have one shareholder to deal with, and then the platform effectively deals with the retail syndicate through their own devices. We had a client that did a real estate equity syndicate through the crowd, and again, it's everybody on the crowd is investing in a single LLC. That LLC is a 30% owner of another LLC that's joined with a 70% owner that's comprised of the fund families. And so you don't have this issue of trying to track down 2,000 people to get SIG pages signed because as a member of your crowd investment LLC, you've sort of ceded all of your management control to the managing member and to the advisor. And so, from that perspective, it's not something where you're tracking down signature pages for lockups or consents or anything like that. In terms of the big investment banks, it's really been a mixed bag. Most of them don't even consider crowdfunding to be a real option for most of their clients. Their clients are in the middle market and the upper tier structures, and most of them need a combination of credit and equity. And the crowd is not a great provider yet of credit or debt financing, despite what we've been speaking about earlier. The early stages of Reg A is starting to build. Only a few companies have been successful at doing large-scale debt working capital raises through the crowd. So the investment banks, I don't think are threatened because they will always be needed for providing credit and also for providing larger check, later stage equity.
Mark, any kind of wrap-up comments that you have about things that you are seeing that you haven't mentioned before, and any predictions kind of for the upcoming year that you'll see the SEC probably, more likely the SEC do with respect to any of the existing regulations that might affect us?
Well, I'm not necessarily expecting any great regulatory changes, with the exception of the accredited investor definition, and that could be very interesting. I will note a couple things about that. One is this differentiation between accredited and non-accredited has basically been in our securities laws for the last 85 years. And on the whole, it has worked pretty well. The theory being that wealthy people, not necessarily smarter, but can hire Sara, can hire Brian, and even unwealthy people can hire me. The concept, they can hire lawyers, they can hire accountants, they can hire investment bankers to protect themselves, whereas non-wealthy people need the paternalistic arm of the government around their shoulders. This concept has worked pretty well. The second thing is, we really have had a very significant change in the accredited investor definition over the last 30 years. Because the numbers we have today, 200 of income, 1 million of net worth, are the same as they were in 1982. Now, in 1982, those numbers were pretty big numbers. In 2017, they are much, much smaller numbers. And that's a big change in real dollars. And of course, the reason the SEC has allowed that to happen is, as Sara says, there just hasn't been fraud related to accredited versus non-accredited investors. I don't know that there will be a huge change. When they do change the definition, I don't know there's going to be a huge change, but it will. We're going to have lots of panels and articles and stuff from all of us, so that'll make life interesting. And the only other thing, my prediction is, I think real estate will continue to be the by far dominant industry in all of crowdfunding, in certainly Title II and Title IV. I don't know what the numbers are today of what percentage real estate investments make of the total industry, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's more than 90%. Do you think that's...
On the equity side,
yeah, equity side. And I think in the Regulation A space, that's going to continue to be true, and I think specifically REITs. REITs will be the dominant Regulation A investment for the foreseeable future.
Sara?
Okay, so I've got kind of more of an aspirational expectation. I'm really hoping that in the next year we're going to see some attention by the SEC on the implications of Section 12G, which is the thing that says if you've got more than 2,000 investors, no more than 500 of whom can be non-accredited, you have to register as a full reporting company. Now, there are conditional exemptions for that for Reg CF and also Reg A. Both of which are inadequate and both of which have the potential to push companies into fully reporting status before they need to be. So I would really hope that we'll have the ability that the SEC will focus on 12G and give the relief that was actually originally in the SEC's proposing release, as opposed to the way the regs were adopted in final. And then the other thing I think we're going to see is sort of looking forward over the next year, I think we're going to see companies working out what it means to have an enormous shareholder base and what happens when you've got 2,000 investors and you can't find 200 of them. Because a lot of the information, one of the ways that people are trying to make the whole onboarding system non-frictional is not to get a lot of information about the investors. So investors like that are very easy to lose, but they're still your investors. And you still have state securities laws about how you communicate with them, that you communicate with them, that in some cases you even let them vote. And so we're going to see a lot of companies challenged on the investor relations side, state escheatment laws. Didn't think I'd ever be talking about those. But if you've got a shareholder that you've lost touch with, what are you supposed to do with their shares, and when? And how do you deal with it? And who is there to help you deal with it? Good transfer agents are able to help. And I hadn't realized that there are cases where some transfer agents don't actually provide that. So that's going to be a challenge for companies over the course of the next year. You've now got 1,000 people you've got to keep track of, and they're moving around. So big challenge.
So I've spent 5 years doing predictions, and every year I'm just terrible at it.
Do you do them in advance or?
No. I'm done. So I'm done. But
Who's
I
gonna win this
predicted
year's
5
Super Bowl?
years ago that we'd have this industry that was really,
Patriots?
it was like driven. Yeah, I bet the Falcons. And that was driven. That was driven by this kind of marketing, technology core. And that hasn't really turned out at all to be true. What we see now is we see a lot more companies that are looking at aspects of the Jobs Act, for example, in the Reg A space, traditional real estate companies and other things. But about a year ago, I made, the prediction that Trump could never become president of the United States. And because it was so absurd, right? And I told everybody in Silicon Valley there was no chance. And so subsequently, I've signed up for Twitter. And so I'm following this. And so this isn't a prediction. This is just an observation. So after 5 years, kind of end of days has now come upon us. And I know that because at 3 a.m., I look at my phone and there it is. We are giving DJ Paul a Lifetime Achievement Award today. That is that is a demonstration that we're kind of done. So with that being said,
Well, that could be optimism. Maybe he's coming to the end of.
maybe that's right. Maybe that's true. But in any case, we all toast you, DJ Paul, and we'll look forward to seeing more compliance next year and a sunny disposition from Sara. But we are around as usual and look forward to continuing to be a resource. So thanks.
Thank you. Great job.